Have you ever wondered what love looks like when it blooms behind barbed wire? When two hearts find each other in the most impossible circumstances imaginable? When choosing to say yes to forever means defying every rule, every expectation, every boundary that war has created between human beings? Picture this. It's the summer of 1944. The Texas heat shimmers off endless prairie land where a prisoner of war camp sits like a small city carved from dust and determination. Inside these walls, thousands of German soldiers wait out a war that feels increasingly distant from their daily reality. But on one particular August morning, something extraordinary is about to unfold. Something so remarkable, so unprecedented, so completely impossible that it would challenge everything you think you know about love during wartime. What I'm about to share with you will shake you to your core because, buried in the archives of a small Texas town, lies documentation of the most extraordinary wedding ceremony in American military history. A ceremony that took place not in a church or courthouse, but in a makeshift chapel behind the barbed wire of Camp Hearne. A wedding that brought together not just two hearts, but two worlds that were supposed to remain forever divided. This isn't just another war story. This is a testament to the power of human connection to transcend the artificial boundaries that conflict creates. This is proof that sometimes the most profound acts of courage happen not on battlefields, but in quiet moments when ordinary people choose love over fear, hope over hatred, understanding over the comfortable distance of us versus them. I spent months researching this incredible account, piecing together fragments from military records, personal letters, and testimonies that survived decades of bureaucratic filing and family secrets. What I discovered was a love story so impossible, so heart-stopping, so completely unprecedented that it reads like fiction. But every detail is real. Every bureaucratic battle, every whispered conversation, every moment of breathtaking courage actually happened in a prisoner of war camp that most people today have never heard of. The story begins with Maria Elena Rodriguez, a 23-year-old teacher from the nearby town of Hearne, Texas. She was everything you'd expect from a small-town schoolteacher in 1944, devoutly Catholic, fiercely intelligent, and possessed of the kind of quiet strength that comes from believing deeply in the power of education to change lives. Before the war, she had dreamed of traveling to Mexico City to study literature. Now she spent her days teaching English to the children of local farmers while volunteering at the camp's educational programs. The prisoner of war camp at Hearne was unlike anything most Americans had ever imagined. Built to house German soldiers captured during the North African campaign, it sprawled across hundreds of acres of Texas prairie. The prisoners lived in wooden barracks, worked on local farms, and attended classes designed to prepare them for eventual repatriation. It was a world within a world, complete with its own newspaper, theater troupe, and surprisingly, its own chapel where both Protestant and Catholic services were held every Sunday. Klaus Brenner was 25 years old when he arrived at Camp Hearne in the spring of 1943. A former philosophy student from Munich, he had been drafted into the Wehrmacht despite his personal reservations about the war. Captured during the retreat from Tunisia, he arrived in Texas speaking broken English and carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and a battered copy of Goethe's poetry that had somehow survived his capture. Klaus was different from many of his fellow prisoners. While others focused on maintaining military discipline and planning for their return to Germany, he threw himself into the camp's educational programs with an intensity that surprised even the American administrators. He studied English with religious devotion, learned about American history and government, and volunteered to teach German literature to other prisoners who wanted to maintain their connection to their homeland's cultural heritage. The camp's educational program was the brainchild of Colonel James Morrison, a career military officer who believed that education could serve as a bridge between former enemies. Morrison had observed that prisoners who engaged with learning were less likely to cause disciplinary problems and more likely to develop positive attitudes toward their captors. More importantly, he genuinely believed that these men would one day return to Germany, and that their experiences in America could influence the kind of country Germany would become after the war. It was in this context that Maria Elena first encountered Klaus during one of her weekly visits to teach English conversation classes. The program paired local volunteers with prisoners who wanted to improve their language skills. Maria Elena had volunteered because she believed that education was a moral imperative, that every person deserved the chance to learn regardless of their circumstances or nationality. Their first meeting was awkward in the way that most cross-cultural encounters tend to be. Klaus struggled with English pronunciation, while Maria Elena battled her own preconceptions about German soldiers. She had expected to find either fanatic Nazis or broken men consumed by guilt. Instead, she discovered someone who quoted American poetry with surprising accuracy and asked thoughtful questions about democracy, literature, and the American educational system. Klaus, meanwhile, had expected to encounter either pity or hatred from his American teacher. Instead, he found someone who treated him with professional respect and genuine curiosity about his thoughts and opinions. Maria Elena never asked about his military service or his political beliefs. Instead, she focused on helping him understand the nuances of English grammar and the cultural context that shaped American literature. Their weekly sessions became the highlight of both their weeks. Klaus would spend hours preparing questions about American authors, while Maria Elena found herself researching German literature so she could better understand the cultural references that shaped Klaus's worldview. What began as language instruction gradually evolved into something deeper and more complex. They discovered shared passions for poetry and philosophy that transcended national boundaries. Klaus introduced Maria Elena to the works of Rilke and Hearne, while she shared her love for Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman. They debated the role of literature in society, the relationship between individual conscience and social responsibility, and the possibility of building a better world after the war ended. These conversations took place in a classroom setting under the watchful eyes of American guards, but the emotional connection growing between them was impossible to ignore. Klaus began looking forward to Tuesday afternoons with an anticipation that had nothing to do with improving his English skills. Maria Elena found herself thinking about their discussions throughout the week, preparing responses to points Klaus had made during their previous meetings. The other prisoners began to notice Klaus's transformation. He walked with more energy, smiled more frequently, and threw himself into camp activities with renewed enthusiasm. His English improved dramatically, but more importantly, his entire outlook on life seemed to brighten. Fellow prisoners joked that he had been infected by American optimism, but Klaus knew the truth was more complicated and more dangerous than simple cultural exchange. Maria Elena was experiencing her own transformation. She had always been somewhat reserved in her personal relationships, focusing her emotional energy on her students and her family. But her conversations with Klaus awakened intellectual and emotional depths she hadn't known she possessed. She began questioning assumptions about nationality, loyalty, and the nature of human connection that she had never examined before. The breakthrough came during their 8th session together, when Klaus shared a poem he had written in English about the Texas landscape. The poem described the way morning light transformed the prairie grass into something that looked like ocean waves, how the endless sky made him feel both insignificant and connected to something larger than himself. The imagery was beautiful, but what struck Maria Elena most powerfully was the vulnerability Klaus had shown in sharing something so personal. In response, she shared her own writing for the first time. A short story about a young woman who dreams of traveling to distant places, but finds meaning in the small moments of connection she experiences in her everyday life. The story was clearly autobiographical, and Klaus understood that Maria Elena was revealing something profound about her own hopes and fears. That afternoon marked the beginning of a relationship that would challenge every rule, every expectation, and every boundary that existed between them. They were teacher and student, American and German, free citizen and prisoner of war. But they were also two young people discovering that love recognizes no borders when hearts find their perfect complement. The camp's administration began to notice changes in both Klaus's behavior and Maria Elena's teaching methods. She requested additional materials for her English classes and started spending extra time preparing lessons that seemed unusually complex for basic language instruction. Klaus's English proficiency was advancing far more rapidly than other prisoners in the program, suggesting that he was receiving additional practice beyond their weekly sessions. Colonel Morrison observed these developments with growing interest. He had seen many relationships develop between prisoners and local volunteers, but most were simple friendships based on shared interests or mutual respect. What was happening between Klaus and Maria Elena seemed different, more intense, and potentially more problematic from an administrative standpoint. The colonel faced a delicate balancing act. The educational program was succeeding beyond his expectations, with prisoners showing remarkable progress in language skills and cultural understanding. But he also had to maintain discipline and security within the camp, while respecting the sensibilities of the local community that had embraced the volunteer program. The situation became more complicated when other volunteers began commenting on the obvious chemistry between Klaus and Maria Elena. Their weekly sessions had become the subject of gentle teasing among the other teachers and curious speculation among the prisoners. What had begun as a private connection was becoming a public phenomenon that demanded some form of official response. The crisis that would force everyone to confront the reality of their relationship was approaching faster than anyone realized. By the autumn of 1943, Klaus and Maria Elena had fallen deeply in love, though neither had spoken the words aloud. They communicated through poetry, through shared glances, through the careful selection of literary passages that expressed feelings too dangerous to voice directly. Their love story was about to collide with the harsh realities of wartime regulations, military discipline, and social expectations that had no framework for understanding what was growing between a German prisoner of war and an American schoolteacher in the heart of Texas. The autumn of 1943 brought changes to Camp Hearne that would test every relationship within its boundaries. As Allied victories in Italy and the Pacific made headlines in local newspapers, the mood among the prisoners shifted from hopeful resignation to anxious uncertainty about their futures. Some began receiving letters from home describing bombing raids and food shortages. Others heard nothing at all, their families lost somewhere in the chaos of a collapsing empire. Klaus found himself caught between two worlds with increasing intensity. His fellow prisoners still saw him as a German soldier temporarily detained by circumstances beyond his control. The American staff viewed him as a model prisoner whose cooperation made their jobs easier. But Klaus was becoming someone entirely different, someone whose heart had found its home in a place that defied every category that others tried to impose upon him. Maria Elena faced her own impossible navigation of expectations and desires. Her family had begun asking questions about her frequent trips to the camp, her sudden interest in German culture, and the way her entire demeanor had changed since beginning her volunteer work. Her mother, a deeply religious woman who attended Mass every morning, worried that her daughter was becoming too emotionally invested in work that should remain purely charitable. The other teachers in the volunteer program had noticed the electricity that seemed to crackle in the air whenever Klaus and Maria Elena were in the same room. During group sessions where multiple prisoners and volunteers worked together, their awareness of each other was so pronounced that it became almost uncomfortable for observers. They would catch each other's eyes across crowded classrooms, share private smiles over shared literary references, and find excuses to extend their conversations long after other pairs had finished their lessons. Colonel Morrison made his decision on a crisp November morning when he called Elena into his office for what he described as a routine evaluation of the educational program. The conversation began with praise for her dedication and effectiveness as a language instructor. Klaus had made remarkable progress in English comprehension and spoken fluency, far exceeding the achievements of other prisoners in the program. But the colonel's tone shifted as he moved into more sensitive territory. He had received reports from guards and other volunteers about what appeared to be a personal relationship developing between Elena and Klaus. While he appreciated her commitment to her teaching duties, he needed to ensure that all interactions between prisoners and civilians remained appropriate and professional. Elena felt her cheeks burn as she listened to the colonel's careful words. She understood that he was being diplomatic, but the implication was clear. Her feelings for Klaus had become visible to others, and that visibility created problems that extended far beyond her personal happiness. The colonel was offering her a choice, though he phrased it as guidance rather than an ultimatum. She could continue her volunteer work with the understanding that her interactions with Klaus would be limited to group settings under direct supervision. Her one-on-one teaching sessions would be reassigned to another prisoner who needed intensive language instruction. This arrangement would allow her to continue contributing to the educational program while eliminating the source of concern about inappropriate relationships. Alternatively, she could step away from the volunteer program entirely, focusing her energies on her regular teaching duties in town. The colonel made clear that this would not be viewed as punishment or failure, but simply as a recognition that sometimes circumstances create conflicts that are best resolved through separation. Elena requested time to consider her options, though she knew that neither choice addressed the fundamental reality of what had grown between her and Klaus. Love doesn't respect administrative solutions or military regulations. The heart doesn't recognize the authority of colonels or the wisdom of maintaining appropriate boundaries between prisoners and civilians. She returned home that evening to find her family gathered around the kitchen table, their expressions serious in a way that suggested they had been discussing her situation before her arrival. Her father, a man who rarely involved himself in emotional matters, spoke with unusual directness about his concerns regarding her volunteer work at the camp. The conversation that followed was unlike any the family had experienced before. Elena found herself defending not just her volunteer activities, but her right to form relationships based on personal choice rather than social expectations. Her parents worried about gossip in their small community, about the potential consequences of their daughter becoming known as someone who had formed an attachment to a German prisoner. Her younger brother, who had enlisted in the army and was training for deployment to Europe, couldn't understand how his sister could develop feelings for someone who had worn the uniform of America's enemies. The philosophical discussions about literature and democracy that meant so much to Elena seemed irrelevant to him when measured against the reality that American boys were dying in battles against German soldiers. The family argument continued late into the night, with positions hardening rather than softening as emotions escalated. Elena realized that she was not just defending her relationship with Klaus, but challenging fundamental assumptions about loyalty, nationality, and the nature of human connection that her family had never questioned before. Klaus was experiencing his own crisis as word of the colonel's concerns reached the prisoner population through the informal networks that carry information through any confined community. Some of his fellow prisoners accused him of betraying German honor by forming romantic attachments to an American woman. Others worried that his visibility would bring unwanted attention to the entire camp population, potentially resulting in restrictions that would affect everyone's privileges. The camp's German leadership structure, which operated parallel to American military authority, called Klaus before their own disciplinary committee. These men had maintained military hierarchy and traditional values despite their captivity, viewing themselves as temporary residents rather than permanent immigrants. Klaus's relationship with Maria Elena represented a form of cultural betrayal that threatened the solidarity they had worked to preserve. The committee's questions were direct and uncomfortable. Did Klaus intend to remain in America after the war ended? Had he forgotten his obligations to his family and homeland? Was he allowing personal desires to compromise his identity as a German soldier and citizen? The interrogation lasted for hours, with Klaus defending choices he wasn't entirely sure he understood himself. These parallel pressures from American authorities and German prisoners created an impossible situation that had no clear resolution. Klaus and Maria Elena were being pulled apart by forces that represented competing definitions of loyalty, duty, and acceptable behavior. Every choice available to them seemed to require betraying someone or something they cared about. The winter of 1943 brought news that would change everything once again. Reports filtered through official and unofficial channels that Germany was losing the war more decisively than anyone had previously understood. The prisoners at Camp Hearne began to realize that their captivity might last much longer than originally anticipated. Some would eventually be repatriated to a defeated Germany. Others might find ways to remain in America permanently. This shifting timeline transformed Klaus and Maria Elena's relationship from a temporary wartime romance into something with potentially permanent implications. They were no longer just two people who had found each other across enemy lines. They were two people who might have to choose between love and every other connection that had previously defined their identities. The conversations they managed to have during supervised group sessions took on new urgency as they began discussing possibilities that had seemed unthinkable just months earlier. Could Klaus find a way to remain in America after the war ended? Would Maria Elena be willing to build a life with someone whose homeland had become America's enemy? How do two people choose each other when that choice requires abandoning everything else they have ever known? Winter deepened into the coldest months anyone in Texas could remember, but Klaus and Maria Elena felt as though they were standing at the edge of a cliff, preparing to jump into an unknown future that would either destroy them or transform them into people they had never imagined becoming. The answer to their impossible situation came from the most unexpected source imaginable. Father Miguel Santos, the camp's Catholic chaplain, had been watching the unfolding drama between Klaus and Maria Elena with the careful attention of someone who understood that matters of the heart often transcend the boundaries that institutions try to impose upon them. Father Santos was not your typical military chaplain. A Mexican-American priest who had grown up in the border regions of Texas, he spoke fluent Spanish, English, and surprisingly, German. He had studied theology in Rome before the war, where he had developed friendships with seminary students from across Europe, including several Germans who had opposed the Nazi regime from within their own country. The priest had noticed the way Klaus attended both Protestant and Catholic services, not out of religious confusion, but from a genuine seeking for meaning that transcended denominational boundaries. He had observed how Maria Elena's volunteer work had evolved from simple charity into something that seemed to fulfill a deeper spiritual calling. Most importantly, he had recognized something in their connection that reminded him of the kind of love described in Scripture, the kind that transforms individuals into better versions of themselves. Father Santos requested private meetings with both Klaus and Maria Elena during the first week of February 1944. These weren't counseling sessions in the traditional sense, but conversations about faith, purpose, and the mysterious ways that divine providence sometimes works through human relationships that seem impossible by worldly standards. Klaus confided his growing certainty that his future lay in America, not in the Germany he had left behind. The philosophy student who had been drafted into a war he never believed in was discovering that love had the power to create new identities, new loyalties, new definitions of home and belonging. He spoke of dreams where he and Maria Elena built a life together, teaching in small Texas towns, raising children who would know both German poetry and American democracy. Maria Elena shared her own revelation that her feelings for Klaus had awakened something profound about her understanding of love itself. She had always thought of love as something that happened within predictable boundaries, between people who shared the same background, the same nationality, the same expectations about the future. But loving Klaus had taught her that the heart recognizes no borders when it encounters its true complement. Father Santos listened to these confessions with the wisdom of someone who had spent years helping people navigate the space between divine calling and human limitation. What he heard in their words convinced him that he was witnessing something extraordinary, a love story that could serve as a bridge between two worlds that desperately needed healing. The priest began researching military regulations, immigration law, and Catholic doctrine with the thoroughness of someone preparing for battle. He discovered that, while romantic relationships between prisoners and American citizens were strongly discouraged, they were not explicitly forbidden under certain circumstances. More importantly, he found precedents for marriages between foreign nationals and American citizens that had been recognized by both military and civilian authorities. The legal pathway was complicated but not impossible. Klaus would need to formally request permission to remain in the United States after the war ended, a process that required sponsorship from American citizens who could vouch for his character and his commitment to democratic values. Maria Elena would need to demonstrate that their relationship was genuine and substantial, not a wartime infatuation that would dissolve under peacetime pressures. But Father Santos understood that the legal obstacles were nothing compared to the social and cultural barriers they would face. A wedding between a German prisoner of war and an American schoolteacher would create a scandal that could destroy careers, divide communities, and generate headlines that neither of them was prepared to handle. The solution he proposed was audacious in its simplicity and revolutionary in its implications. If Klaus and Maria Elena were truly committed to building a life together, if their love was strong enough to survive the challenges ahead, then they should formalize their commitment in the sight of God before attempting to navigate the bureaucratic maze that surrounded them. Father Santos was proposing a wedding ceremony inside Camp Hearne, conducted according to Catholic tradition, witnessed by both prisoners and American personnel, blessed by religious authority that transcended national boundaries. The ceremony would not be legally recognized until Klaus's immigration status was resolved, but it would create a spiritual and moral foundation for everything that followed. The priest explained his reasoning with the clarity of someone who had thought deeply about the theological implications of what he was suggesting. Marriage was a sacrament that existed independent of government recognition or social approval. If two people were prepared to pledge their lives to each other before God, if they understood the magnitude of the commitment they were making, then the Church had the authority to bless their union regardless of the political circumstances surrounding them. Klaus and Maria Elena spent weeks considering Father Santos's proposal, understanding that accepting it would change everything about their situation. A wedding ceremony would make their relationship impossible to ignore or dismiss as a temporary wartime attraction. It would force everyone around them to confront the reality of what they had chosen and to decide whether they would support or oppose their commitment to each other. The decision was complicated by the knowledge that a camp wedding would create precedents that could affect other prisoners and volunteers. If Klaus and Maria Elena were permitted to marry, other couples might demand similar recognition for their relationships. The camp's administration would need to develop policies for situations that no military manual had ever contemplated. Colonel Morrison faced the most difficult decision of his military career when Father Santos formally requested permission to conduct the wedding ceremony. The colonel had built his reputation on maintaining discipline while encouraging the kind of cultural exchange that could contribute to post-war reconciliation between former enemies. But a wedding between a prisoner and an American citizen would test the limits of what even the most progressive military leadership could accept. The colonel spent sleepless nights weighing competing considerations that seemed to have no clear resolution. Military regulations emphasized security and good order, values that suggested romantic relationships between prisoners and civilians should be discouraged or forbidden entirely. But the educational program had succeeded precisely because it treated prisoners as complex human beings rather than simply enemy soldiers to be confined until repatriation. Klaus had become a model prisoner whose cooperation and enthusiasm had influenced dozens of other Germans to engage positively with American culture and democratic values. Maria Elena had proven herself to be an exceptional volunteer whose teaching had contributed measurably to the camp's educational mission. Their relationship, whatever its complications, had grown from the kind of cultural bridge building that the colonel had been ordered to encourage. The breakthrough came when Colonel Morrison received guidance from his superiors in Washington, who had been monitoring the Hearne experiment with great interest. The War Department was already planning for post-war reconstruction efforts that would require Americans who understood German culture and Germans who appreciated American democratic values. Klaus and Maria Elena represented exactly the kind of cross-cultural partnership that might prove invaluable in building a peaceful future. The official authorization arrived on a cold March morning with language that was carefully crafted to avoid setting unwanted precedents while acknowledging the unique circumstances at Camp Hearne. Father Santos was granted permission to conduct a religious ceremony that would be recognized by the church but not legally binding until Klaus's immigration status was resolved through proper channels. The news of the approved wedding spread through the camp like wildfire, generating reactions that ranged from celebration to outrage to bewildered curiosity. Some prisoners saw Klaus as a traitor who had abandoned his German identity for personal gain. Others viewed him as a pioneer who was showing them a path toward American integration that they had never considered possible. The local community in Hearne was equally divided in their responses to the unprecedented announcement. Some residents admired Maria Elena's courage in following her heart despite social conventions. Others worried that accepting marriages between prisoners and Americans would encourage relationships that could compromise community security and traditional values. The wedding preparations began immediately, with Father Santos coordinating details that had never been attempted in American military history. The ceremony would take place in the camp's chapel on a Sunday afternoon in early April, with attendance limited to immediate family members, camp personnel, and a small number of prisoners who had become Klaus's closest friends during his captivity. Maria Elena's family remained deeply conflicted about their daughter's choice, but they gradually came to understand that her happiness depended on their support for a decision that challenged everything they had believed about appropriate relationships and social boundaries. Her mother spent hours praying for guidance about how to love her daughter, while accepting choices that seemed to defy common sense. Klaus faced his own family crisis as letters from Germany revealed his parents' shock and disappointment at news of his planned marriage to an American woman. They had expected their son to return home after the war to resume his interrupted life as a German citizen. The idea that he might choose to remain in America permanently felt like a betrayal of everything they had sacrificed during his absence. The wedding preparations became a community effort that brought together people who had never imagined they would cooperate on such a project. American guards helped Klaus obtain appropriate clothing for the ceremony. Fellow prisoners contributed small gifts and decorations that transformed the simple chapel into something worthy of the extraordinary occasion. Maria Elena's students at the local school created a wedding banner with messages written in both English and German, their artwork representing the kind of cultural bridge that their teacher's marriage symbolized. Local women who had initially opposed the relationship found themselves donating flowers and helping with reception preparations, as they began to see Klaus and Maria Elena as individuals rather than symbols of political conflict. The week before the ceremony brought a final crisis that threatened to cancel everything they had worked toward. A group of local citizens filed formal complaints with military authorities, arguing that the wedding would set dangerous precedents and undermine community morale. Their petition demanded that the ceremony be postponed until after the war ended and Klaus's legal status was clarified. Colonel Morrison found himself defending his decision to superiors who were beginning to question whether the Hearne experiment had gone too far beyond acceptable military practice. The colonel argued that canceling the wedding would destroy months of progress in prisoner rehabilitation and community relations, but he acknowledged that proceeding might create problems that would affect his career and the future of similar programs. The resolution came from an unexpected source when local religious leaders from multiple denominations issued a joint statement supporting Father Santos's authority to conduct the ceremony. Protestant ministers, Catholic priests, and even the town's rabbi declared that marriage was a sacred institution that transcended political boundaries, and that love between individuals should be celebrated rather than condemned. This religious coalition provided the moral authority that military officials needed to proceed with the wedding despite continuing opposition from some community members. The ceremony would take place as scheduled, with the understanding that it represented an act of faith in the possibility of reconciliation between former enemies. The morning of April 15, 1944, dawned clear and warm, with spring flowers blooming across the Texas prairie in defiance of the previous winter's harsh cold. Inside Camp Hearne, preparations for the most extraordinary wedding in American military history were reaching their final stages as two hearts prepared to say yes to forever behind barbed wire that could not contain the power of love to transform everything it touches. The chapel at Camp Hearne had never witnessed anything quite like the transformation that took place during those final hours before the ceremony. What had begun as a simple wooden structure built for Sunday services was being transformed into something that seemed to shimmer with possibility and hope. Maria Elena arrived at the camp gates at 10 o'clock that morning, wearing a simple white dress that had belonged to her grandmother. The dress had been carefully altered by local seamstresses who had volunteered their services despite their own reservations about the wedding. The fabric was delicate cotton with tiny pearl buttons that caught the Texas sunlight as she walked through the checkpoint that had become as familiar to her as her own front door. Klaus had spent the previous evening with his closest friends among the prisoners, men who had become his brothers during nearly 2 years of captivity. They had organized their own version of a bachelor party, sharing stories and memories while acknowledging that this wedding represented more than just personal happiness. Klaus was crossing a threshold that would change his identity in ways that none of them could fully comprehend. The German prisoners who supported Klaus had worked for days to create decorations that honored both American and German traditions. They had carved wooden ornaments, crafted paper flowers, and even composed a song that blended melodies from both cultures. Their efforts represented more than wedding preparation. They were creating art that expressed their own complicated feelings about home, belonging, and the possibility of building new lives in a foreign land. Father Santos had prepared for this ceremony with the same intensity that medieval monks brought to illuminating sacred manuscripts. He had studied every relevant passage of Scripture, consulted with theologians from 3 different denominations, and prayed for guidance about his role in blessing a union that would challenge every conventional understanding of appropriate wartime relationships. The priest understood that he was not just performing a wedding ceremony, but creating a new form of religious witness that could influence how future generations thought about love, forgiveness, and the possibility of reconciliation between former enemies. His words would be remembered and quoted long after the war ended, making this ceremony a theological statement as well as a personal celebration. Colonel Morrison had spent the morning reviewing security arrangements that were unprecedented in their complexity. He was responsible for ensuring the safety of both prisoners and civilians while accommodating family members, religious officials, and military personnel who had never before attended a wedding inside a prisoner of war camp. Every detail had been planned with military precision, but the colonel knew that the most important elements of the ceremony were beyond his control. The guest list represented a careful balance between personal meaning and institutional necessity. Maria Elena's immediate family would attend, despite their continuing reservations about her choice. Klaus's closest friends among the prisoners would serve as witnesses and supporters. American camp personnel who had worked most closely with both Klaus and Maria Elena would participate as representatives of the military community that had made this extraordinary event possible. Local officials from Hearne had been invited as a gesture of respect for the community that had embraced the prisoner education program, despite their initial skepticism. The mayor, the school superintendent, and several prominent business leaders would attend as symbols of civilian support for an experiment in cross-cultural understanding that had exceeded everyone's expectations. The morning hours passed with the strange combination of excitement and nervousness that characterizes all wedding days, but this celebration carried additional weight because of its historical significance. Everyone involved understood that they were participating in something that had never happened before and might never happen again. The ceremony would be photographed and documented as part of the official record of the Camp Hearne experiment. Maria Elena spent the final hour before the ceremony in quiet conversation with her mother, two women who had found their way to understanding despite fundamental disagreements about love, loyalty, and appropriate choices during wartime. Her mother had come to recognize that her daughter's happiness required accepting decisions that challenged everything she had believed about proper relationships and social boundaries. The conversation between mother and daughter was conducted in Spanish, their shared language creating intimacy that English could never provide. Maria Elena's mother offered her blessing with words that acknowledged both her fears and her growing respect for Klaus as an individual, rather than a symbol of enemy nationality. The blessing was accompanied by a family rosary that had been passed down through generations of strong women who had faced their own impossible choices. Klaus was experiencing his own moment of reflection as he prepared for a ceremony that would formalize his commitment not just to Maria Elena, but to America itself. He had written letters to his family in Germany explaining his decision to seek permanent residence in the United States after the war ended. The letters were honest about his love for Maria Elena, while also expressing his belief that America offered possibilities for the future that Germany could no longer provide. The responses from his family had been mixed, ranging from his mother's tearful acceptance to his father's angry disappointment. Klaus carried these complicated emotions as he dressed in the civilian clothes that Father Santos had helped him obtain for the ceremony. The simple dark suit represented more than wedding attire. It symbolized his transformation from German soldier to American immigrant, from prisoner of war to free man choosing his own destiny. The chapel began filling with guests at 1 o'clock, each arrival representing a small victory over the social and institutional obstacles that had threatened to prevent this ceremony from taking place. Maria Elena's students from the local school had been given permission to attend, their presence symbolizing the educational mission that had brought the couple together in the first place. The atmosphere inside the chapel was unlike anything anyone had experienced before. German prisoners sat alongside American guards, former enemies united in their support for a couple whose love had transcended the boundaries that separated their nations. Local civilians occupied pews next to military personnel, civilians and soldiers sharing space in recognition that some human experiences transcend the categories that usually divide people from each other. Father Santos entered the chapel wearing ceremonial vestments that had been specially blessed for this unprecedented occasion. The priest had chosen to conduct the ceremony in both English and Latin, languages that could be understood by participants from different cultural backgrounds. His selection of scripture passages emphasized themes of reconciliation, hope, and the power of love to transform hearts that had been hardened by conflict and separation. The music for the ceremony had been arranged by the camp's German prisoners working in collaboration with Maria Elena's church choir from town. The musical selections blended traditional wedding hymns with folk songs from both cultures, creating a soundtrack that honored the diverse backgrounds of everyone involved while expressing universal themes of love and commitment. Klaus entered the chapel accompanied by two fellow prisoners who had become his closest friends during captivity. These men had initially opposed his relationship with Maria Elena, viewing it as a betrayal of German solidarity and military honor. But they had gradually come to understand that Klaus's choice represented a form of courage that deserved their respect and support rather than their condemnation. The moment when Maria Elena appeared in the chapel doorway created a silence that seemed to hold everyone's breath. She walked down the aisle accompanied by her father, a man who had struggled to understand his daughter's choice, but who had ultimately decided that love deserved his blessing regardless of its complications. The simple white dress transformed her into something luminous, a bride whose radiance seemed to illuminate the entire space. Klaus felt his heart stop as he watched Maria Elena approach the altar, where Father Santos waited with an expression of profound solemnity. The young man who had arrived at Camp Hearne as a defeated enemy soldier was about to marry the woman who had taught him that home was not a place but a person, that loyalty could transcend nationality when hearts found their perfect complement in each other. The ceremony itself began with words that Father Santos had crafted specifically for this unprecedented occasion, language that acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances while emphasizing the universal nature of the commitment being made. The priest spoke of love as a force that could heal divisions between peoples, of marriage as a sacrament that created unity from difference, of hope as the foundation upon which all meaningful relationships must be built. Klaus and Maria Elena exchanged vows that they had written themselves, promises spoken in voices that carried across the chapel with surprising strength despite their obvious emotion. Klaus promised to honor Maria Elena's courage in choosing love over safety, to build with her a life that would justify the risk she had taken on his behalf. Maria Elena vowed to stand beside Klaus as he created a new identity in America, to support his transformation from enemy prisoner to beloved husband and fellow citizen. The rings they exchanged had been crafted by Klaus himself during his free time in the camp workshop. Simple bands carved from wood and metal that represented everything they could offer each other under circumstances that provided few material resources, but unlimited spiritual wealth. These humble rings carried more meaning than diamonds could have conveyed, symbols of love that had grown from nothing into something that seemed capable of moving mountains. When Father Santos pronounced Klaus and Maria Elena husband and wife, the chapel erupted in applause that seemed to shake the wooden walls. German prisoners cheered alongside American guards, former enemies celebrating a union that represented the possibility of reconciliation on both personal and national levels. The sound of their celebration carried across the camp, reaching prisoners in their barracks and guards at their posts, announcing that something extraordinary had just taken place behind barbed wire that could not contain the power of love to transform everything it touched. The wedding reception took place in the camp's recreation hall, a space that had been decorated with flowers donated by local families and artwork created by prisoners who wanted to contribute to this historic celebration. The meal had been prepared by both camp cooks and volunteers from Maria Elena's church, a collaboration that produced a feast combining American and German dishes in recognition of the cultural bridge that Klaus and Maria Elena's marriage represented. The speeches given during the reception were remarkable for their honesty about the challenges ahead, while maintaining hope that love could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. Colonel Morrison spoke about the courage required to choose love over convention, to build relationships that transcended the artificial boundaries created by war and politics. Local officials expressed their growing respect for Klaus as an individual, and their support for his integration into American society after his legal status was resolved. But the most moving moment came when Klaus's fellow prisoners presented him with a hand-carved wooden box containing letters of recommendation from dozens of German soldiers who vouched for his character and his commitment to building a peaceful future. These letters represented more than personal testimonials. They were declarations from former enemies that they trusted Klaus to represent the best possibilities for German-American friendship in whatever world emerged from the ashes of the current conflict. As the celebration continued into the evening hours, Klaus and Elena found quiet moments to absorb the magnitude of what they had accomplished. They had not just gotten married. They had created a new form of human relationship that challenged every assumption about loyalty, nationality, and the possibilities for reconciliation between peoples who had been taught to see each other as enemies. The wedding night was spent in a specially prepared room within the camp compound, a space that had been transformed into something approaching luxury, despite the limitations imposed by military regulations and wartime shortages. Klaus and Elena fell asleep in each other's arms, surrounded by wedding gifts and messages of support from people who had chosen to believe that love could indeed conquer the hatred that seemed to dominate their world. But their story was far from over. The legal challenges ahead would test their commitment in ways that the wedding ceremony could not prepare them for, and the social consequences of their choice would continue to unfold long after the celebration ended. Tomorrow would bring new obstacles, new decisions, and new opportunities to prove that their love was strong enough to survive everything that a world at war could throw against it. The morning after their extraordinary wedding dawned with a reality that neither Klaus nor Elena had fully prepared themselves to face. While their hearts soared with the joy of their newfound union, the practical implications of what they had accomplished began to settle around them like morning fog across the Texas prairie. Klaus woke first, his internal clock still calibrated to the rigid schedule that governed prisoner life at Camp Hearne. For a moment, he lay still in the unfamiliar bed, watching sunlight filter through curtains that had been hung specially for their wedding night. The woman sleeping beside him represented everything he had never dared to dream during those dark months after his capture in Tunisia. Yet even in this moment of perfect happiness, he could not escape the knowledge that their future remained uncertain in ways that love alone could not resolve. Elena stirred as the camp's morning bugle sounded across the compound, its familiar notes now carrying different meaning for her than they had during her months as a volunteer teacher. She was no longer a visitor to this place behind barbed wire. She was now connected to it through bonds that would shape the rest of her life, regardless of how long the war continued or what happened to the thousands of German prisoners who called Camp Hearne their temporary home. Their first breakfast as husband and wife was served in the officers' dining hall, a privilege that Colonel Morrison had extended as a wedding gift, while they navigated the complex process of establishing Elena's status as the spouse of a prisoner of war. The meal was simple by civilian standards, but it felt like a feast to two people who had learned to find extraordinary meaning in ordinary moments shared together. The other diners in the hall watched them with expressions that ranged from curiosity to admiration to barely concealed disapproval. Klaus and Elena had become symbols of something larger than themselves, representatives of possibilities that some people embraced while others rejected entirely. Every conversation they had, every gesture they made, every decision they faced would be scrutinized for evidence that their love was either genuine or misguided. Father Santos joined them for breakfast, his presence providing both spiritual support and practical guidance about the challenges that lay ahead. The priest had spent the previous evening reviewing immigration laws and military regulations with the thoroughness of someone preparing for battle. What he had discovered was encouraging in some respects and daunting in others. The legal pathway for Klaus to remain in America after the war existed, but it would require navigating bureaucratic procedures that had never been tested by cases like theirs. He would need to formally renounce his German citizenship while applying for permanent residence in the United States. The process could take months or even years, during which time his status would remain uncertain and his freedom limited by the continuing conditions of his captivity. More immediately, Elena faced decisions about her own life that would determine how much support she could provide during Klaus's transition to civilian status. Her teaching position in Hearne had become complicated by her marriage to a German prisoner. While the school board had not explicitly asked for her resignation, the subtle pressure to step away from her classroom duties was unmistakable. Some parents had expressed concerns about having their children taught by someone whose loyalty to America might be compromised by her marriage to a former enemy soldier. These concerns were not voiced directly, but they filtered through community networks in ways that made Elena's position increasingly untenable despite her years of dedicated service to local students. The couple spent their first full day as husband and wife discussing practical arrangements that would allow them to maintain their relationship, while Klaus remained technically a prisoner of war. Military regulations prohibited Elena from living within the camp compound, but she could visit daily and participate in the educational programs that had brought them together in the first place. Colonel Morrison had agreed to create a new position for Elena as coordinator of civilian educational services, a role that would allow her to work full-time at the camp while maintaining some distance from the controversies surrounding her marriage. The position would provide income and purpose while keeping her close to Klaus during the uncertain months ahead. The German prisoners at Camp Hearne were adjusting to the reality of having a married couple among their community in ways that created both opportunities and tensions. Some saw Klaus and Elena's relationship as proof that integration with American society was possible and desirable. Others viewed their marriage as a betrayal of German solidarity that could undermine the discipline and cohesion that had helped them survive captivity. These divisions became more pronounced as news of the wedding spread to other prisoner of war camps across the United States. Letters arrived from German soldiers held in facilities from California to Georgia, some offering congratulations and others expressing anger at what they saw as Klaus's abandonment of his duties as a German citizen and military officer. Klaus found himself defending choices that he still didn't fully understand himself. He had not planned to fall in love with an American woman or to build a future in the country that had been his enemy just months earlier. The transformation had happened gradually, through conversations and shared experiences that had opened his heart to possibilities he had never considered before the war changed everything about his life. The couple's second week of marriage brought their first major crisis, when Klaus received a letter from his parents that had been months in transit from war-torn Germany. His mother's words were filled with pain and confusion about his decision to remain in America, while his father's anger was barely contained within the formal language of disappointed authority. The letter described conditions in their hometown that had deteriorated dramatically since Klaus's last communication. Allied bombing had destroyed much of the infrastructure that sustained daily life, while food shortages had reached levels that threatened survival itself. Klaus's parents needed their son to return home after the war to help rebuild not just their family farm, but their entire community. Reading his parents' desperate words while sitting in the Texas sunshine with Elena beside him created a guilt that threatened to overwhelm Klaus's happiness about his new marriage. He was choosing personal love over family obligation, individual fulfillment over communal responsibility, American opportunity over German loyalty. The weight of these choices felt heavier than any burden he had carried during his military service. Maria Elena watched her husband struggle with emotions that she could understand but not fully share. Her own family had eventually accepted her marriage, despite their initial reservations and continuing concerns about social consequences. But Klaus was facing the possibility that his choice to remain in America might mean permanent separation from parents who had already lost too much to the war's devastation. The couple began having long conversations about alternatives that might allow Klaus to honor both his love for Maria Elena and his obligations to his German family. Could they eventually travel to Germany together to help with post-war reconstruction efforts? Would it be possible to bring Klaus's parents to America if conditions in Germany remained difficult after the war ended? These discussions revealed the complexity of building a life that bridged two cultures, two languages, and two sets of family expectations that had never been designed to accommodate the kind of love that Klaus and Maria Elena shared. Every decision they made would require compromise and sacrifice from multiple people who had their own hopes and dreams about the future. The camp's routine continued around them as they navigated these personal challenges, but Klaus and Maria Elena were discovering that marriage had changed their relationship to every aspect of life at Camp Hearne. They were no longer just teacher and student, volunteer and prisoner, American and German. They were husband and wife, a partnership that created new responsibilities and new possibilities for influence within their community. Other prisoners began seeking Klaus's advice about their own post-war plans, viewing his successful courtship of an American woman as evidence that civilian integration was achievable for those willing to embrace American culture and values. Klaus found himself serving as an informal counselor to men who were beginning to consider staying in America, rather than returning to a Germany that might no longer offer the opportunities they remembered. Maria Elena was experiencing similar changes in her role within the local community, as people who had initially opposed her marriage began to seek her perspective on questions about prisoner rehabilitation and post-war reconstruction efforts. Her unique position as an American woman, married to a German prisoner, provided insights that no one else could offer about the possibilities and challenges of reconciliation between former enemies. The spring of 1944 advanced with news from Europe that made it increasingly clear that Germany's defeat was inevitable, though the timeline remained uncertain. This developing reality created new urgency around Klaus's immigration application and new complications for prisoners who were beginning to realize that their captivity might last much longer than originally anticipated. Some German soldiers at Camp Hearne began expressing interest in following Klaus's example by seeking American sponsors who could help them remain in the United States after the war. The camp's administration found itself dealing with unprecedented requests for information about immigration procedures and civilian integration programs that had never been part of their original mission. Colonel Morrison was fielding inquiries from Washington about the Camp Hearne experiment and its implications for post-war policy regarding former enemy prisoners. Military officials were beginning to understand that some German soldiers might prove valuable as allies in rebuilding European democracy, particularly those who had demonstrated genuine commitment to American values during their captivity. Klaus and Maria Elena's marriage had become more than a personal love story. It was evolving into a test case for policies that could affect thousands of prisoners across the American camp system. Their success or failure in building a stable life together would influence decisions about whether other prisoners should be encouraged to seek permanent residence in America. The pressure of serving as symbols for something larger than themselves was both inspiring and exhausting for the newlywed couple. They wanted to focus on building their relationship and planning their future together, but every choice they made was scrutinized for its broader implications about the possibilities for reconciliation between Americans and Germans. Summer arrived with heat that shimmered off the Texas prairie like waves of liquid light, transforming Camp Hearne into an oven where even the simplest activities became tests of endurance. But Klaus and Elena barely noticed the oppressive temperatures, because they were consumed by preparations for the next phase of Klaus's legal journey toward American citizenship. The paperwork required for his immigration application had grown into a mountain of documents that filled multiple file folders with testimonials, recommendations, background investigations, and bureaucratic forms that seemed to multiply with each passing week. Every aspect of Klaus's life, from his childhood in Bavaria to his military service to his relationship with Elena, was being examined with microscopic attention by officials who would determine whether he deserved the privilege of American residence. Father Santos had become their unofficial legal advisor, working with immigration attorneys and military officials to ensure that Klaus's application received fair consideration despite the unprecedented nature of his situation. The priest had discovered that several other German prisoners across the United States were pursuing similar applications, creating a small community of men who were choosing American futures over German pasts. The couple's third month of marriage brought news that would change everything once again, as reports filtered through official channels that the Allied invasion of Europe had begun with massive landings on the beaches of Normandy. The war that had brought Klaus to America was entering its final phase, though the fighting would continue for many more months before Germany's eventual surrender. This development created new urgency around Klaus's immigration case, while also raising questions about what would happen to the thousands of German prisoners in American camps once the war officially ended. Some would undoubtedly be repatriated to help with reconstruction efforts in Germany. Others might be allowed to remain in America if they could demonstrate their commitment to democratic values and their ability to contribute to American society. Klaus and Elena found themselves at the center of discussions about post-war immigration policy that would affect far more people than just German prisoners. American officials were beginning to recognize that the country would need skilled immigrants to support economic growth and international engagement in whatever world emerged from the ashes of global conflict. Their love story, which had begun in a simple classroom behind barbed wire, was becoming part of a larger narrative about America's role in shaping a peaceful future through the integration of former enemies into democratic society. They had chosen each other, but their choice was now connected to choices that would define their adopted country's relationship with the rest of the world. As summer deepened into the hottest months anyone in Texas could remember, Klaus and Elena prepared for the next chapter of their extraordinary journey together, knowing that their love had already survived tests that would have destroyed weaker relationships. The barbed wire that surrounded Camp Hearne could not contain what they had built together, and neither could the obstacles that still lay ahead in their quest to transform an impossible wartime romance into a lasting American marriage. The autumn of 1944 brought changes that would test Klaus and Elena's marriage in ways their wedding vows had not prepared them to face. Word arrived through official channels that Germany's collapse was accelerating faster than anyone had predicted, creating new pressures around the future of prisoner repatriation programs and the legal status of men like Klaus who had chosen American futures over uncertain German homecomings. The couple's fourth month of marriage coincided with the arrival of a new camp administrator, Major William Henderson, whose reputation for strict military discipline preceded him like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Henderson had been transferred from a facility in Colorado where several escape attempts had created public relations disasters that Washington was determined not to repeat at other installations. The Major's first official act was to review all special arrangements and privileges that had been granted to prisoners under Colonel Morrison's more lenient administration. Klaus and Elena's marriage immediately drew his attention, as an unprecedented deviation from standard operating procedures that might require immediate correction to maintain proper military order and security protocols. Henderson scheduled private meetings with both Klaus and Elena during his first week at Camp Hearne, interviews that felt more like interrogations than administrative reviews. The major questioned every aspect of their relationship, from their initial meeting in the educational program to their decision to formalize their commitment through a religious ceremony that had created publicity extending far beyond the boundaries of rural Texas. Klaus faced particularly intense scrutiny about his motivations for seeking permanent residence in America, with Henderson probing whether his marriage was genuine or simply a calculated strategy to avoid repatriation to a defeated Germany. The major's questions were designed to reveal inconsistencies or contradictions that might justify canceling the special privileges that had allowed their relationship to develop and flourish. Elena encountered similar skepticism about her decision to marry a former enemy soldier, with Henderson suggesting that her judgment might have been compromised by misplaced sympathy or naive romantic idealism. The major seemed determined to find evidence that their marriage was either fraudulent or inappropriate, grounds that could justify separating them until Klaus's legal status was permanently resolved. The couple's evening conversations took on new urgency as they realized that their carefully constructed life at Camp Hearne was being threatened by administrative changes beyond their control. Henderson's review could result in Klaus being transferred to a different facility, effectively ending their ability to maintain their marriage until the war's conclusion and his immigration application's approval. Klaus and Elena's extraordinary love story reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, the human heart refuses to recognize the artificial boundaries that conflict creates between us. Their wedding behind barbed wire proved that love doesn't just conquer hatred, it transforms it into hope for a better world. Sometimes the most powerful acts of rebellion happen not through violence, but through two people choosing to see each other's humanity when the entire world demands they remain enemies.